Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time, as you might imagine, talking in just a few minutes about the issue of separating children at the border for a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, this is in the news right now. I would have to say that part of the focus in the news is to take focus off of some other very important issues, not the least of which is the Inspector General report, which we talked about yesterday. There are some times where you say, are we just being played? Is this something to distract us? Well, there's certainly some very important issues at the border. And, of course, you have Senator Ted Cruz now that has proposed some legislation that might solve some of the problems we talked about yesterday here on Point of View. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But at the same time, I think a wise and discerning individual, a consumer of news, needs to recognize that this is a way to distract individuals. For example, you probably up until recently haven't heard almost any news report about the economy. Why? Because the economy has been doing very well. Most of the people in the media do not like the president, so they're not going to talk about it. Stock market dropped precipitously today, so all of a sudden we're going to hear economic news. But as long as things are humming along, there's really no news of issue at all. And so, again, I think it's important to recognize that not only do you pay attention to what's on the news, but sometimes ask the question, what is not on the news that might be relevant as well? So we'll get into that in just a minute. But I thought, especially since we're broadcasting to those of you in Dallas, and I recognize some of you in Minnesota listening right now, there has become a real controversy surrounding billboards that say America is a Christian nation. I mean, I know that's shocking, but that's where the controversy has begun. And I'll just simply read from our friend Todd Starnes, because he actually, I think, has done a pretty good job of summarizing a lot of things that have happened simultaneously. And that is, he says, billboards promoting a celebration of faith and freedom at First Baptist Church in Dallas were removed after complaints from the Dallas mayor, Mike Rawlings, and the Dallas Morning News. The patriotic billboard campaign included the title of a sermon, which was going to be given and will be given this Sunday by Dr. Robert Jeffress on June 24th. The title of the sermon is America is a Christian Nation. Now, for those of you watching online, I'll show you a picture of what it looks like here. You got a picture of Robert Jeffress, special message, America is a Christian Nation. Well, that was just too much. I mean, the billboard company really got all sorts of flack and decided that they would just have to pull it down. Jeffress told the Todd Starnes radio program the other day, we were told by the billboard company that the message was divisive. America's a Christian nation. That message is divisive. Tomorrow we're going to do our Millennial Roundtable. I'm thinking I might just do one of my hours just on the issue, is the content of that message. Is the idea that America is a Christian nation, is that divisive for our millennial generation? But we'll talk about some of that tomorrow. But nevertheless, you might say, well, where did the concept come from? Dr. Robert Jeffress, very honest about that. He said the sermon title was inspired by comments made by the Supreme Court Justice John Jay, and also by another Supreme Court Justice, David Josiah Brewer, both of whom, and I might just mention that John Jay was not only a Supreme Court Justice, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and former president of the American Bible Society. Matter of fact, when he wrote what are a few of the Federalist Papers, he was the vice president of the American Bible Society. But nevertheless, Both these Supreme Court justices described America as a Christian nation. So it seemed like a good way when you're going to have all sorts of celebration. And one thing that First Baptist does, and I'm well aware of that, is that they celebrate the 4th of July earlier on a Sunday so that sometimes people might even leave their other church to come there on, in this case, June 24th, and then still make it back to their own church on the Sunday before 4th of July. But nevertheless, we'll leave that as it is. And again, the idea was, he said, that the message will present the historical evidence for the bedrock faith upon which I should say America was founded, which is a Christian nation. But that, unfortunately, was too controversial. The Dallas Morning News and Mayor Rollins blasted the pastor's sermon title, suggesting it was hateful and divisive. Let me give you a couple quotes. The mayor told the newspaper, Dallas Morning News, "This is not the Christ I follow. It's not the Dallas I want to say things that do not unite us but divide us. I never heard those words. The voice came out of Christ, just the opposite. I was brought up to believe, be proud of yours, but do not diminish mine." A lot of it came from a column that actually appeared in the Dallas Morning News that stated that the controversy itself was part of the issue. And it actually had a column that came out on June 7th. First Baptist Pastor Robert Jeffress' Gospel of Division does not represent my Dallas. And he said the columnist was triggered by the billboard as he was stuck in traffic, looked at it, and he said, "My rabbi warned me that there would be days like this. All I saw Wednesday was someone telling me and everyone else who does not worship Jesus Christ that we do not belong here." That's reading a lot into what essentially is 5 words on a billboard. But nevertheless, we'll keep going. Then again, going back to the piece by Todd Starnes, he said the following day the church received a message from the billboard company that their signed contract was being canceled and the billboards would be taken down. A representative of Outfront Media actually said, "We are getting hammered by the media for the America is a Christian Nation tagline on the billboards. The Dallas Morning News and other news affiliates are doing stories on how it's offensive and bigoted. Someone called our corporate office in New York about the offensive billboards, and following our lawyer's advice, we will take them down as soon as possible." The church offered to revise the sermon title with something like, "Well, is America a Christian nation?" ? But that too was rejected by the billboard company. And so the pastor said, "We were told that the title was anger-provoking rather than thought-provoking." The local representative was apologetic, but it was clear that the New York-based company was no match for some of those individuals. And so, again, this is what Robert Jeffress said. He said, "The reason those on the left do not want people to hear my message is that they know the historical evidence is on my side, that America was founded on the principles of the Christian faith. We will not be deterred as we defend the foundational values of our country." And so, again, you can see some of the other material that's available there. You've got the City Hall spokesman that defended the mayor, saying that Mayor Mike Rollins on Twitter speaks for the real Dallas. The guy on the billboard does not. So a little bit of a Twitter war has developed as well. And, of course, one other thing that Todd Starnes pointed out is, to be clear, First Baptist Church has no beef with Outfront Media. They're a privately owned company, and they have the right to decide who they do business with. And so that is certainly kind of the latest controversy over a billboard with the 5 words, "America is a Christian nation." But apparently it was even too controversial that even if you put a question mark, "Is America a Christian nation?" even that was seen as too hateful. So the billboards came down. Just thought you'd like to know a little bit about that. By the way, if any of you have any comments about pulling the billboards, about whether or not America is a Christian nation, something I might get into tomorrow in our Millennial Roundtable, but I thought you'd like to know that that's the controversy that not only unfolded in Dallas, but now has become a little bit more of a national issue because of a little bit of a Twitter war and even some of the comments by Todd Starnes with Fox News. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Major depression has surged in the United States among young Americans. That is according to a report based on medical and survey information conducted by Blue Cross Blue Shield. The survey looked at 41 million people covered under the insurance plan. Why the dramatic increase? Perhaps further study will give more definitive answers, but the report has some educated guesses. The researchers suspect that online activities such as social media and video games may be part of the problem. Add to this the social isolation that comes from spending too much time in front of a screen, and you have some possible reasons for increased depression among the young. The actual numbers are alarming. Diagnoses of major depression increased by a third between 2013 and 2016. That breaks down to 63% increase for adolescents and a 47% increase among millennials. Dr. Karen Horowitz is a psychiatrist in Rhode Island who is quoted in the study. She says, "It is possible increased rates of depression in adolescents are related to a combination of increased electronics use and sleep disruptions in already vulnerable individuals. Increased use of electronics, video games more commonly in boys, and social texting and media more commonly in girls, can lead to increased conflict both within the home and with peers." We do know that some people are born with genetic traits that make them more vulnerable to depression in response to trauma and other negative situations. We do have to wonder how increased online activities affect those people in particular. I think we now have in this new report another warning of the potential dangers of allowing young people to spend too much time in front of a screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, let's get back to the issue of kids at the border and separation and all of that. And I mentioned how this happened yesterday, but I would look for, and I think have found, a simpler way to summarize what took me a couple of minutes, to put it mildly, yesterday to try to explain it. And that comes from a piece by David French. I find myself quoting from him so often because oftentimes because he writes a column from a Christian point of view, because he has a legal background, and because I think he's pretty fair-minded. I just keep finding material that he publishes that looks better than some of the others that I find. And he started a column yesterday, although I'm going to come back to a more recent one that came out now that you have Ted Cruz proposing a bill. But he came up with yesterday a good way to help us understand that almost everything we're dealing with right now is a result of, in a sense, executive orders or something like that. This is not the way to run the border. This is not the way to run immigration. And I appreciate the fact that he lays blame at least 3 administrations for that. Let me read his piece and then kind of exegete it so it makes sense. He says, one presidential administration enters into a consent decree that creates a nationwide policy for the detention, release, and treatment of minors in the custody of federal immigration authorities and makes it binding on future administrations. Okay, what is that consent decree? Well, that is one that we talked about before just the other day, the Flores Settlement Agreement, which if you really want to lay some blame, maybe even have to go back an additional one, because that actually happened in 1997, although it was accepted by George W. Bush. So one administration, the Bill Clinton administration, accepts this consent decree that comes out ultimately and supported by the Ninth Circuit Court. So that's the first issue. Then you have kind of status quo through the rest of the Clinton administration and all of the Bush administration. And then you get to his next sentence in the paragraph. Another administration, that would be Barack Obama, unilaterally implements a catch and release policy for illegal immigrants that works to incentivize additional illegal immigration, including illegal immigration by families with kids. And that has to do with the idea that if someone comes to the border, whether they're seeking asylum or not, we then say, okay, you will have to appear at this particular hearing, but we will release you. As I've said on this program so many times, as a fly fisherman, catch and release works well with trout. Catch and release does not work well with individuals who already came here illegally and have no intention of showing up for their hearing, which is exactly what takes place. So then they're now in the country. Even though they've been processed, nothing happens. So we have the first administration, that's under Bill Clinton, which has a consent decree that actually has a policy for detention, release, and treatment of minors in custody. Then we have catch and release, ultimately, under the Obama administration. And now, his next paragraph. Then the next administration reverses course, adopting a so-called zero-tolerance policy that effectively combines with a consent decree to create a new punishment for misdemeanor offense of illegal entry into the United States, and that is what? Family separation, including the separation of very young children from their parents. Now, he goes on to make the case that, can you even imagine that any president or even a member of Congress intended to have family separation to be the natural and inevitable consequence of prosecuting unlawful entry? No, but that's exactly what we have. How much of this was passed by Congress? That would be zero. How much of it was even seriously debated in Congress? I think most of that, there may be some debate that I'm not aware of, might be zero as well. But yet this chain of events from a consent decree, which essentially created a law without a statute, and then the decision later on of showing what's called prosecutorial discretion, which resulted basically in catch and release, and then the decision now by this administration to say, wait a minute, this is not working because these people aren't showing up. And besides, if they are seeking asylum, we have to take them through a longer process. So we'll have to at least have the children not under the care of Border Patrol because they're already very busy. So we'll put them under the care of the Department of Health and Human Services. And you have the situation we have right now. And so it's, I think, helpful to understand that. Now, that eludes everybody. I watched last night Jimmy Kimmel and Ted Cruz play basketball, and I use that advisedly. That wasn't the best basketball I've ever seen, although it was surprising some of the shots they did make. But there would be constant sort of breaks where Jimmy Kimmel would then, berate Ted Cruz on this issue or that issue. But again, a lot of it was just simply unfair. This has been a problem, if you will, brewing since the 1990s through the first decade of the 21st century, now into the second decade of the 21st century. And now because many families are coming, they didn't come a year ago because they felt that Donald Trump was serious about enforcing the border, that there was going to be a wall, that there would be a lot more prosecution. They eventually came to the conclusion that this was just mere talk. And because you had various caravans of kids and now caravans of families, they said, let's just get in here because if indeed they ever do get serious, let's cross the border whenever we can. And we have the situation we have right now. Now, before we get into the solution that has been put forward by Ted Cruz, because I want to get into that a little bit, I do appreciate our friends at the Daily Signal. They did fact-checking 4 claims about detaining children at the border, done by Fred Lucas. And again, I haven't bothered to post this because, it's kind of a moving target, but it's something to really begin to pay attention to. And in just a minute, we'll get into the whole issue of family separation and the rest. But let's, if we can, real quickly, give kind of a quick answer to that. And here are 4 of the claims that have been made more recently. The first one is, who's to blame? Democrats or Trump? And Donald Trump never misses an opportunity to point a finger, said the Democrats forced that law upon our nation. Fred Lucas goes on to say Democrats, backed by some media commentators, counter that it's not the law but a Trump administration policy. Actually, experts say the situation is a combination of a bipartisan law and a Clinton administration policy. And I think I just gave that to you, but let's real quickly get into it again. 1997 is when the Clinton administration entered into what was called the Flores Settlement Agreement. As a matter of fact, on the piece that we've posted here, if you'd like to read the actual consent agreement, the HTML link actually allows you to go and read it in its entirety if you'd like. I don't recommend it for anybody, but it's certainly the case in which you had a class action lawsuit, which it was actually brought back in the 1980s, but resolved by 1997. Then he goes on to say that the settlement established a policy that the federal government would release unaccompanied minors from custody to their parents, relatives, and other caretakers after no more than 20 days, or alternatively determine the least restrictive setting for the child. Then in a separate development in 2008, this is the part I haven't really gotten into, but let's get into it. Congress, in that time, was controlled by the Democrats. So this was something that was pushed forward by Nancy Pelosi. Approved bipartisan legislation, because it was bipartisan, to combat human trafficking. And since George W. Bush was still the president, he signed it into law. And there is a section in the law which is called the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, states that an unaccompanied minor entering the United States must be transferred to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement rather than the Department of Homeland Security, which we've talked about before. Then you have the U.S. Court of Appeals and the Ninth Circuit Court expanded this Flores settlement in 2016 to include children brought to this country illegally by their parents. And so you've had most of this policy created either under a Clinton administration or under the waning days of the Bush administration through a democratically controlled Congress, and then some other appeals that came from our friends at the Ninth Circuit Court in California. So that's how we ended up where we are. Number two, is this unprecedented action by the Trump administration? Some media outlets have called the practice of separating children from parents at the border unprecedented, a new low for the United States. And again, what's different under the Trump administration is the zero tolerance approach to enforcing the existing immigration laws and policy. And so this was an attempt, and this goes back to in May 7th in Scottsdale, Arizona, where Attorney General Jeff Sessions directed federal prosecutors to prosecute all adults who illegally enter the country, including those accompanied by their children. So that gives you a little bit. I'll come back to a couple of other claims. There are these concentration camps, because we've heard from a number of people, both Republicans and Democrats. Is that the case? And are we right now taking babies from nursing mothers? So some of these are pretty significant claims. We'll see if we can do some fact-checking on that. Then we'll talk about this bill that Senator Ted Cruz has put forward, which I think really has a chance of passing. We'll talk about that right after this.
Nancy was uncomfortable, to say the least. As an introvert, she didn't like controversy. But when she learned that parents were prohibited from seeing the contents of a major standardized test, she knew her responsibilities as a parent needed to outweigh her discomfort. Her daughter turned out to be the only student in her district to opt out of the test, and one of just a handful in the entire state of Texas. But she stood her ground, and the next year, Point of View helped her unite with other parents to make a difference for their children. The world loves to force us into its mold and to mock believers when we resist. Your gift to Point of View is an investment in courage and changed lives. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. Be part of amazing transformations. It all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking in to pointofview.net. One day, you were going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to leave a note on our Facebook Live post that we also, of course, broadcast live, that is available as well. And as we wind down this half hour, we want to also mention as a program note that in the next hour, Jonathan Petersen will be with us, put together this great book, The Case for Biblical Self-Defense. I've never seen anything quite like it before. Individual I used to work with when he was the religion reporter for United Press International. Those of us remember the days when there was a UPI. Of course, now, of course, have Associated Press, but he was with UPI, and so I was a good friend and thought we would work our way through that. Then we also have Daniel Darling with us. He is an individual with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Wrote a piece a while back on the issue of civility, and I thought we would get into that as well. Solution to incivility, avoid provocation, fighting, and all the rest. So we'll get into those conversations. In the third hour, even though you cannot hear that on our local stations here, we, of course, broadcast on the national network as well. Christiana Holcomb will be with us, and we're going to talk about this coffee house in the state of Maryland. It's a Christian coffee house, and they actually have a time when a band comes in and does worship music. Oh, I can't do that. That's a violation of something or other, zoning or whatever, so we're going to talk to her about that. Also get an update on some of the ADF cases. You had one that came down. The Masterpiece Cake case was already decided 7-2. We are still waiting for one from California having to do with pregnancy resource centers. So we've got a lot to cover, and let's get back into this real quickly, because the second kind of fact check was, is this unprecedented action by the Trump administration? Well, yes and no, depending on how you look at it. Has the administration created a new law? No. They simply said, we are going to stop having this catch and release policy. We're going to have a zero tolerance approach, which is actually what's mandated by the law. So if you see that as new or unprecedented, okay, but is it any different than what has happened before President Barack Obama allowed individuals to just kind of go into the area? And again, this has to do with a statement made by the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, May 7th in Scottsdale, Arizona, which he directed federal prosecutors to prosecute all adults who illegally enter the country, including those which were accompanied by children. So if you see that as new, then yes. If you see that as doing what the law requires, then the answer is no. Here's how to think this through. There are some analysts that have looked at this and said, okay, you only have a couple of choices here. The Trump administration currently faces two options, according to this article. Either release every family that crosses the border and claims asylum and know that most of them will never show up at their immigration court hearing. So that's option number one. That is what has been practiced primarily under the Obama administration, at least the latter years of the Obama administration. Or number two, release the child as required by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals interpretation of the Flores settlement while holding the parents while awaiting trial, which is exactly what we have right now. Those are really your options. Maybe there's a third option I haven't thought of and this article hasn't thought of, but that's where we find ourselves right now. Okay. So first of all, this piece of 4 claims about detaining children, kind of a fact check. We looked at, is this a problem with the Democrats or the Trump administration? Is this unprecedented by the Trump administration? Let's take the third one. These are concentration camps. Whoa. Where did that come from? Well, actually, it came from people that actually served in the Bush administration or actually served in the Republican Party. So this isn't just the Democrats making this statement. For example, former CIA Director Michael Hayden, who served under President George W. Bush, and former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele, you might remember him, who also was Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, both compared the practice to Nazi concentration camps. So again, if you see that these camps are not summer camps, as some have said, or they're not really camps at all, and they're just enclosures. And I've seen some people on Fox and Friends try to make that case. Let's get back to the issue there. But nevertheless, the pictures that you are seeing are the minority. Most people don't realize that. And again, if you're going to be a wise discerner of news, recognize that what you're seeing are those children that are either in a holding place or have not been claimed. In the last fiscal year, and of course now we're in a new year, but let's just use this, 90% of the children were released to a sponsor who was either a parent or close relative, according to the department. So you're seeing the minority of those, but you are seeing some. And as we have certainly begun to see, there is a flood coming in right now that is going to be remarkable. I'm going to get into that in just a minute, but let me take the fourth and final question, and that is, are we taking babies from nursing mothers? I hope you can kind of understand that that might not be the case. There was a report the other day about an illegal immigrant from Honduras who claimed her nursing daughter was pulled away from her before she was handcuffed. And yet, in a conference call, a senior Department of Homeland Security official said this was not the case. In particular, that individual said, quote, "We do not separate breastfeeding children from their parents. That does not exist. That is not a policy. That is not something DHS does. We believe that that is false." Now, again, not having on-the-ground reporters to go and fact-check it, I'll have to just leave it at that. But that's where we find ourselves with some of the hyperbole making its way into the news every single day. And if you're going to be a wise discerner of the news, what you see on television, what you read in the newspaper, what you find on websites, even what you listen on to radio programs like this one, take the time, check it out. Okay, can we solve this problem? Well, there's a couple of ideas. One is that Senator Ted Cruz has actually put together what he thinks is a piece of legislation that has a possibility of passing. And by the way, if this one does not pass, and you can't find even any Democrats in the Senate to go along with it, that's going to tell you that a lot of them see this as an issue they want to keep festering because they see this as a campaign issue. So I think we'll find out real quickly, since there's a piece of legislation being put forward, how many are really interested in solving the problem and how many of them see this as a campaign issue. But again, let's look at this. Ted Cruz announced a plan to introduce a comprehensive emergency legislation designed to deal with the unnecessary separations of illegal immigrant children from their parents. A bill actually would double the number of immigration judges to 750. That's one of the problems. We have this incredible logjam that's taking place right now because you have so many individuals showing up at the border. And it would also mandate that illegal immigrant families be kept together unless, and this is what the legislation says, there has been an aggravated criminal conduct or there's a threat of harm to the children. Now recognize some of the parents that are separated from these children aren't parents. They're parents. Can I use scare quotes there or various kinds of, because they really aren't. They pretend to be, and that is not the case. The legislation would also authorize new temporary shelters for immigrant families and provide for the expedited resolution of asylum claims within 14 days. That's been the big holdup, as I pointed out yesterday. Sometimes it takes more than 20 days. If you remember the Flores agreement, remember that agreement said you can't keep them for more than 20 days. There's the difficulty. If we can get this done within 2 weeks and we have more judges, a lot of this problem goes away. Okay, there's another bill, wouldn't you know. Democrats have also come together as well, and they have what is called the Keep Families Together Act, and that one has been proposed by Senator Dianne Feinstein. The bill has a different, maybe even a higher standard for separating kids at the border and would generally only allow the practice if there, quote, is evidence of parents abusing the children or children being trafficked, unquote. And under the Democrats' bill, separation could only happen after a consultation with a child welfare expert. So it raises the bar a little bit. I don't know, and I can't find in the bill or any of the information about the bill whether or not it would actually increase the number of judges or authorize temporary shelters. Perhaps what we'll end up with is a bill that might do both. but we will see. And this, I think, illustrates once again why we need to pay attention to some of those issues, because after all, what we're talking about is a very significant crisis. It's not just the optics, it's the reality on the ground. But if we want to have any kind of orderly process of dealing with people at the border, then obviously we've got to increase the number of judges, increase the temporary shelters, because we are dealing with enormous number of people. Just in one facility in McAllen, Texas alone, you already have 200 such children, and more are coming every single day. Let's take a break. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1998, Pastor Richard Barr started a halfway house ministry in his hometown of Sinton, Texas. The idea was to offer housing, biblical instruction, and counseling to probationers and parolees as they prepared to transition back into civil society. For Pastor Barr, an ex-con himself, this was more than a ministry. It was personal. Barr ran the in-home ministry to ex-cons from his own home, located just a few feet from his church in Sinton, Texas. Things were going smoothly until about a year later, when the city passed an ordinance preventing halfway houses within 1,000 feet of any church, school, park, or residential area. The city of Sinton at the time was less than 2.2 miles square, consisting of less than 6,000 residents. There was no place else for Barr to run his ministry in town. The city fathers had literally run him out of town with this ordinance, a fact they were later to admit was intentional. First Liberty Institute represented Pastor Barr and his ministry. We argued that the city violated the Texas Religious Freedom Restoration Act by substantially burdening his free exercise of religion without a compelling justification. The Texas Supreme Court agreed and invalidated the ordinance as to our client. Barr's case is yet another example of how a state's RFRA protects a small ministry seeking to do good to his community from the overbearing hand of a government. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention in the next hour, Jonathan Petersen will be with us as we talk about his new book, actually booklet, The Case for Biblical Self-Defense. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about the issue of civility. But I want to get into the Inspector General report. But let me just mention real quickly, since we've been talking about this whole issue of children at the border, lots of times people say, well, how do I think about this biblically? And certainly the other day, the Attorney General got all sorts of criticism because he said, well, the Bible says we're supposed to obey those in authority. And, of course, that is Romans 13, verse 1. Now, he was pilloried for that, but whether you believe the Bible or not, I think you recognize that there are some very compelling cases for the fact that a government should be obeyed and borders should be enforced. And so certainly on the one hand, if you want to look at some of your biblical convictions, you would have to say that Romans 13, 1-7. You'd also have to say the idea of fixed borders, which you even see in Deuteronomy 32. And also in Proverbs 22, to mention just a few examples of borders and landmarks, certainly are described in the Scriptures. But even if you don't accept the Bible, a nation that does not actually have borders and does not enforce those borders is not a nation. So on the one hand, I think we can think about this biblically in terms of our biblical convictions. But on the other hand, as I so often say, there's also our issue of biblical compassion. And that is, especially if you look at the Old Testament, although I'm going to give you a New Testament reference too, the book of Deuteronomy, and also a little bit in the book of Numbers. You know, those are those books that we hardly ever read unless we're in one of those read through the Bible in 1 year plan. But if you read through Deuteronomy, chapter 10, for example, or Deuteronomy chapter 24, the gleaning laws, or the idea of the tithe, Deuteronomy 14, and many other passages, you can see that, first of all, government was, in that time, of course, the church itself, if you will, before the church, the Israelite nation, the theocracy, probably the better way to say that. But today we can say that that applies to those of us in the church. We should have compassion for the sojourner, for the alien in the land. And that was true in the Old Testament. I think it's also true in the New Testament. Matter of fact, in Deuteronomy 10, it says we are to love the sojourner. In Exodus 22, right there with the Ten Commandments, it also says you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him. And by the time we get to the New Testament, let's just pick one verse out of, say, the book of Hebrews, Hebrews 13. We should not neglect to show hospitality to the stranger. So I think any of our policies has to have both our biblical convictions and our biblical compassion. On the one hand, we recognize the rule of law, but on the other hand, we recognize that we are to treat individuals who are here as foreigners or as aliens, as sojourners, with compassion. So I think those are some key verses that we should be thinking about as we move forward with some of the policies that have been implemented. And more importantly, I think it is time to ask our elected representatives to do something, because if you have paid attention over the last half an hour, almost 40 minutes, I pretty much have shown you that a consent decree that was agreed to in the Clinton administration, some final actions that were taken during the latter days of the Bush administration by a Democratic Congress, then a decision to have essentially catch and release under the Obama administration, and now some decisions again that were implemented by the Attorney General and the President under the Trump administration, all resulted in the fiasco we have right now at the border. And I think it's about time for members of Congress to step up and do the right thing. Another thing they need to do is take seriously some of the things we've learned from the Inspector General report. I have a piece by Gary Bauer, and he's talking about some of the things that we have learned, one of which is that there weren't just a few leaks in the Department of Justice and in the FBI. There was, if you will, a whole culture of leaks. Let me quote from part of the Inspector General report to make the case. They said, second, although FBI policy strictly limits the employees who are authorized to speak to the media, we found that this policy appeared to be widely ignored during the period we reviewed. That would be under, of course, the Obama administration. We identified numerous FBI employees at all levels of the organization with no official reason to be in contact with the media, who were nevertheless in constant and frequent contact with reporters. The large number of FBI employees who were in contact with journalists during this time period impacted our ability to identify the sources of leaks. In other words, it's so leaky there at the FBI, we can't even figure out which one of the many leakers was responsible for leaking so much information to the press. Along several documented examples. For example, Horowitz, who actually was part of this Inspector General report, found that one official had communicated 26 times with one reporter and 7 times with another reporter. And so that is one kind of interesting thing. But also there is evidence in this report that it is quite likely that the former FBI Director James Comey actually was covering for President Barack Obama and did so by lying to the American people. Because during a March 2015 interview, you might remember that President Obama was asked when he learned that Hillary Clinton had been using an unofficial email account for government business. And you might remember President Obama said the same time everyone else learned it through the news reports. But that's not true. You can look at a footnote on page 89, if you'd like, of this report, in which it says FBI analyst and prosecutor 2 told us that former President Barack Obama was one of the 13 individuals with whom Clinton had direct contact using her Clinton email.com account. And so you can see that that might have also been one of the other reasons why James Comey held his fire with any kind of prosecution of Hillary Clinton, because obviously if President Barack Obama knew that Secretary Hillary Clinton was not using an official state government email address, because he obviously was communicating with her and she was communicating with him, then you can see the possible fallout for the president. So these are just a few things that are surfacing as people are taking the time to read through this multi-hundred-page document that has come out. And if nothing else, the controversy right now at the border has taken this off of the front page. And you just have to wonder how much of that was accidental, how much was intentional. But it certainly is one of those times in which we will try to keep track of some of the things that we're learning from the Inspector General's report. And that's another reason why you just need to pay attention to some of these important issues right here at Point of View. Let me just mention that on our website here, we've got a couple of articles. The one that I mentioned, first of all, family separation, is the piece that I quoted from earlier, which if you would like to read through some of the things that David French talks about, and even has an HTML link to the actual consent decree, you can see where some of this unfolded. But over the last couple of days, I think it's become a lot simpler to simply say decisions made in the 1990s, then kind of modified in the first or maybe the 8th year of the first new century, and then modified again under the Obama administration, and now brought back to what was intended under the Trump administration, have created the controversy that we have today of children being separated from their parents. Tonight, you'll see a constant drumbeat about what is happening at the border. We'll see how much we'll hear about legislation being proposed to try to rectify that. And more importantly, I'll be watching, and hope you will be as well, to see how many people want to just keep the controversy going and how many people really want to solve the problem, because I think what Ted Cruz has put forward makes a lot of sense and maybe be the best way to solve the problem at the moment. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We will probably a little bit later get talking about this issue of family separation. That is something in the news. And, of course, you have Senator Ted Cruz, who's actually put forward some legislation that may solve that problem, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I thought for just a few minutes we might come to this booklet that came to me recently from a friend of ours that actually has begun to make the case for biblical self-defense. It is a booklet that was made available on the anniversary date in which Congress authorized the minting of coins bearing America's motto, "In God We Trust," and it's really an attempt to try to provide a guide to look at more than just 2 or 3 Bible verses, but at almost 100 different verses and examples of how to think through this idea of self-defense from a biblical point of view. The author is Jonathan Petersen. We've known him as he was the religion news reporter for United Press International, and is an individual that has graduated from Moody Bible Institute, also from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and has an MBA in marketing from the University of Phoenix, been involved in Christian radio for some time. And Jonathan, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's good to talk with you again. Thank you for inviting me.
We'll talk about this. You know, I've known you over the years as the religion reporter, so I wasn't surprised that you had thought about how to address this issue from a Christian perspective. But at the same time, you know, I didn't know as much about your interest in self-defense, concealed carry, those kinds of things. And talk about this, because this is a resource that I think would be very helpful, because as you well know, some Christians have said, well, I think the Bible teaches that I should be pacifist, and I have some friends that are, so I understand that. But I think if you really look at the warp and woof of Scripture, you can see that there are times when we are called upon to use physical force, both in the government and in protecting ourselves individually. And so tell us a little bit about the genesis of how you came to put together this booklet.
Yeah, well, thank you. Late last year, my son-in-law actually asked me if I thought it was in keeping with my Christian faith, you know, was it biblical that I believed in self-defense the way I do? And I tried to answer him as best I could. I really hadn't given it a whole lot of thought at the time. And in my answer to him, it occurred to me that I wasn't satisfied with my answer. So that set me on a quest to study the Bible and determine for myself, well, where exactly does self-defense fall within my Christian faith, and how can I see biblical passages, verses, not just take them, you know, individually, but see the context of them, see the message throughout the Bible, and how does it pertain to the self-defense topic.
Well, and again, you're interested in what we might call the shooting arts. Matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was not here on a Friday because they did a Sporting Clays event for a very prominent Christian ministry, and I thought, well, that would be the case. But you do know, Jonathan, that there are people that you've met, especially when you worked at UPI, that would say, I can't even imagine that a Christian would own a gun. And then you go to tournaments where you shoot a gun. What's wrong with you? And so this is another value of this booklet, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I think my desire was originally just to assuage my own thinking regarding the topic and its relation to the Bible, the more I passed it, the paper that I wrote, the more I passed that around to my family, the more they said, you should publish this booklet to help others in their thinking. And so I took their words, and I actually did publish the booklet, and perhaps it will help others think through the issue.
Let's see if we can kind of work our way through at least the general categories, and if people want to get a booklet, of course, we'll talk more about that in a minute. But you have a section on the biblical background for contextual understanding, and that really gets back to the idea that if you believe that we're created in God's image, if there is free will, if murder is wrong, then it does seem to me that there are going to be some times when you might be able to make the case that self-defense is exactly the appropriate response when there is an evildoer who's going to try to take your life.
Right. What I wanted to do in writing the booklet was look at the entire Bible, Old and New Testament passages, and see how it applied to our modern issue today. So I looked back, and realities came forward. There's conflict in the Bible. There's confrontation. There is violence in the Bible. So how does that all play together? Well, I started with God. God is love. God is not he doesn't only exhibit love, but his whole essence is love. So how do you, how can we look at conflict and violence and self-defense logically? How can they exist within the context of divine love? So I went back and started at the beginning. God created humans in his image. That means we have his DNA in our spirit, in our cells. In all people are created in his image. They're God bearers. And because of that, we all have worth. We are precious. Having the image of God means that we're rational. We have volition. We have a moral compass. We have a self-consciousness that sees our inherent value apart from just functionality or utility. And as such, we need to value that in each person. Well, if someone doesn't value that and causes violence against another person, God has set up in Genesis that he demands an accountability for that, just because we are God bearers. And so with that in mind, I proceeded to look at, okay, what does the Bible say? How does it progress? And how can we, or where does self-defense fall into all this? God created humanity with the ability to make decisions. That's free will. One item that really came out to me in writing the booklet was just how important free will is. God holds free will very high. He allows us to make decisions, good and bad decisions, and he works within our own free will in the choices that we make to follow him, to pursue him, to abstain from sin and evil, or those people who want to pursue evil. He allows that. Well, so free will is very important and plays a large role in the whole biblical aspect of why self-defense is necessary and allowed by God.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues. The biblical case for government enforcement of justice, which is pretty straightforward because that takes us back to Romans 13 and other passages. And then the biblical case for individual self-defense in its various forms, avoidance, escape, limited, lethal, and we'll get into those issues. Part of this new booklet, The Case for Biblical Self-Defense. I thought it would be of interest to you, and if as we go along today, you would like to ask a question, that number is 1-800-351-1212, and we are privileged to have with us for a little bit longer Jonathan Petersen and his booklet, The Case for Biblical Self-Defense. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Major depression has surged in the United States among young Americans. That is according to a report based on medical and survey information conducted by Blue Cross Blue Shield. The survey looked at 41 million people covered under the insurance plan. Why the dramatic increase? Perhaps further study will give more definitive answers, but the report has some educated guesses. The researchers suspect that online activities such as social media and video games may be part of the problem. Add to this the social isolation that comes from spending too much time in front of a screen, and you have some possible reasons for increased depression among the young. The actual numbers are alarming. Diagnoses of major depression increased by a third between 2013 and 2016. That breaks down to 63% increase for adolescents and a 47% increase among millennials. Dr. Karen Horowitz is a psychiatrist in Rhode Island who is quoted in the study. She says, "It is possible increased rates of depression in adolescents are related to a combination of increased electronics use and sleep disruptions in already vulnerable individuals. Increased use of electronics, video games more commonly in boys, and social texting and media more commonly in girls, can lead to increased conflict both within the home and with peers." We do know that some people are born with genetic traits that make them more vulnerable to depression in response to trauma and other negative situations. We do have to wonder how increased online activities affect those people in particular. I think we now have in this new report another warning of the potential dangers of allowing young people to spend too much time in front of a screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we continue our conversation with Jonathan Petersen. The booklet is entitled The Case for Biblical Self-Defense, and we've talked a little bit about kind of the context, and of course you go into this in such detail. I mean, there are lots of verses that you actually put together, and this, I think, is a great antidote to some that simply quote one or two verses. You go into a great deal of detail. But let's, if we can, move on real quickly to the whole issue of government enforcement of justice. I think that one is pretty straightforward, but let's focus on that for just a minute, because in Romans 13 and in other passages, we can see that certainly God has established government, and government is ordained by God, and government can use and has to use physical force to enforce the borders, to protect us from foreign invaders. It also does not bear the sword for nothing in order to punish evildoers and criminals within its borders. So the use of force there is pretty straightforward, and I think most Christians would certainly accept that, don't you think?
Right. I think it's straightforward. God holds the government authorities responsible for carrying out justice for the common good. And in an ideal world, that would always be perfect justice. Unfortunately, sin is in the world, and there's injustice committed justice within our society, and that's a shame. That's we need to work toward eradicating injustice and be as godly justice as possible, or move in that direction. So God holds those accountable, and God says He doesn't want us to seek vengeance. He has laid on governmental authority that authority to pursue and punish evildoers.
So again, it's not necessarily right for us to seek vengeance, because vengeance is mine, says the Lord. But you have a section, and it's probably the most significant part of your booklet, on a biblical case for individual self-defense in its various forms. But as soon as we talk about that, let's get into a few that people haven't really thought through, and that is, the first one is avoidance, and the next one is escape. If you've ever been through a class that deals with the idea of concealed carry, they spend as much time talking about how to avoid the ever needing to use it. And that, I think, is something else to think about, is that you have some sections here that just simply say, if you can avoid conflict, there is a great wisdom in doing so. So talk about that, if you might.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We need to avoid it as much as possible, and that means we need to be aware of our situation at all times. People need to understand or look around them, see what threats might be there. They shouldn't bury their eyes in their iPhones' screens or walk absent-mindedly. We should be looking ahead, looking around us, and if there is danger, we should seek to avoid it, to escape from it, to get out of there as best we can, and not face the very difficult decision of whether or not to use lethal self-defense. Just use self-defense and get out of there.
Yeah, and again, I always say that you should at least be at code yellow, maybe not code red, but it is amazing to me, on two different places, both where this studio is and also where my office is, where I will go to a garage, and it's amazing how many times I'm following a woman, and they maybe feel like they're in a safe spot, but they're not paying attention to the fact there's somebody next to them, somebody behind them, they're either totally distracted, or like you said, they're on their phone, and they're not even, in a sense, being situationally aware. So there are some really great things to say about that. But let's get into the topic that I think most people wanted to hear, and that is, okay, is there ever a time in which, for example, David used force? Is there ever a time when Jesus suggested that someone might have to get a sword? Take us through some of these Old Testament and New Testament passages that are relevant in your booklet.
Right. Well, I speak of various passages and try to explain them in modern terms. But for example, in Psalm 23, a very familiar psalm, it says, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Well, here, David, writing the psalm, he's used to weaponry. God has used him in battle. He talks about in other psalms, Psalm 144, "Praise be to the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle." He's familiar with swords and other weaponry. Well, he uses the metaphoric imagery of the rod and the staff of a shepherd. Well, the staff, of course, is a tool for support and guiding the flock. The rod is a reference to a handheld, small, concealable, if you like, club-like device that could be used as a striking weapon. And this, of course, would be a protection against murderous enemies or approaching animals. So here in the Bible, it's showing the valuable use of a tool of a defensive protection by the shepherd. It's lyrically praised. It's legitimized within that poetry. That's just one example. Of course, David went on and defeated Goliath, again with a weapon, a sling and stones. But again, God rescued him and blessed his courage in confronting Goliath. Now, Jesus in the New Testament, he endorsed the idea of carrying a protective weapon. In Luke, he says, "He who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." Now, whether he meant that literally or figuratively, either way, Jesus did bring up this topic. He did talk about it, and he was warning the disciples that there were going to be hard times ahead when they would need to be self-sufficient. They would need to be vigilant and ready to protect themselves from harassment, either lethal harassment or benign harassment, but to be aware, to be prepared. And then he talks about in Luke, one of his disciples says, "Lord, here are two swords." And Jesus didn't rebuke them. He said, he didn't say get rid of the swords. He just said that's enough. So he knew that some of his closest followers were carrying personal weapons, and he consented, to that. And Jesus himself, he even used a weapon, a whip, when he drove out the money changers from the temple. Now, having said all that, we need to put it in context that the Bible's main message is to love one another. We are to love God. We are to love our neighbor. We are to seek peace whenever we can. And as we said before, we are to avoid lethal situations as best we can. But if we are backed into a corner and there's no other way, I believe the Scripture does tell us we can defend ourselves.
Well, again, almost 3 pages just of the index of Bible passages, and it's a very thorough resource indeed. So, Jonathan, if people listening to this would like to get a copy of this, how can they do so?
Well, please email me, the Case for Biblical Self-Defense at Outlook.com. That's how you can get the booklet, the Case for Biblical Self-Defense at Outlook.com.
And again, we have a link that we'll put up there to give people a chance to follow that. And if nothing else, I would also mention, just as we're coming down to the end here, that you have some biblical guidelines for self-defense and even a section in the back, which I thought was very helpful as well in terms of what you call my concealed carry code of conduct. So these are just some great resources. And for people that have maybe said, I've had people say, you're a Christian, you have a gun, why? Or you have a Christian and you actually go shooting in some sport or something like that. How can you do that? I think this is a piece of resource that I think is going to be very helpful. So if nothing else, when it came in the mail, I hadn't heard from you in a while, and I was just thrilled that you would put that together, and I would encourage people to contact you and find out a little bit more. So thank you for taking the time not only to write it, but thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby. It was a joy and a privilege. Thank you for inviting me.
We will do it again. Let me again just recognize that we have some of the information that you might want on our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, as he mentioned, the Case for Biblical Self-Defense at Outlook.com is one place you can find it, and we have some other resources available there as well. And maybe we'll pull some of it together and even put it in one of our booklets. You know that recently I put together a booklet on the Second Amendment. So when we revise it, maybe we'll add this to the list, and maybe we'll come back and even find some other ways in which we can use that. Might do a commentary on this, and that would be a way we could also offer that resource as well. So I just thought it would be of interest to you, and when we come back, we're going to talk about this issue of civility. We're going to be talking with Daniel Darling, who is the Vice President for Communications at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he wrote a piece that appeared in National Review and other places. Worried about incivility? Well, start with yourself. And this is one of the topics we've addressed so often here. And we'll learn from him how to gain some insight and some wisdom and even some discernment as we try to articulate biblical views in a culture that sometimes is hostile to them. We'll be back right after this.
Nancy was uncomfortable, to say the least. As an introvert, she didn't like controversy. But when she learned that parents were prohibited from seeing the contents of a major standardized test, she knew her responsibilities as a parent needed to outweigh her discomfort. Her daughter turned out to be the only student in her district to opt out of the test, and one of just a handful in the entire state of Texas. But she stood her ground, and the next year, Point of View helped her unite with other parents to make a difference for their children. The world loves to force us into its mold and to mock believers when we resist. Your gift to Point of View is an investment in courage and changed lives. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. Be part of amazing transformations. It all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking in to pointofview.net. One day, you were going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things you hear us talk about so often is the need for civility. I've gone to use the word civility because sometimes the word tolerance has been completely redefined, but civility is really this idea of the golden rule. You treat other people as you would like to be treated. We as Christians certainly strive to do that, but sometimes political discussions get pretty heated. And it may not necessarily be our problem because we may be very gracious and understanding and willing to listen, but sometimes we are the contributors to that. So I thought this would be a very good piece, and we tried to get Daniel on, but it didn't work out until more recently. This article actually came out last month, and we have posted it again on our website since we've quoted from it. It is entitled, "Worried About Incivility? Start with Yourself." And sometimes fighting the problem can end up perpetuating it. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the practical aspects of civility. Might just mention that even in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, I have a section on civility because I recognize when we're talking about all these contentious issues I write about, abortion, euthanasia, genetic engineering, sexual issues, homosexuality, and then we talk about drugs and crime and punishment and capital punishment, and we talk about the media, and we talk about the environment, and on and on and on. I mean, these can be pretty controversial. So this is why I think it is really important from time to time to do some training. So I wanted to bring Daniel Darling to the microphone to help us out. He's the Vice President for Communications at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. He is an individual that's written a number of books. We'll talk about those in just a minute. Also contributing editor to Christianity Today's CT Pastors. He is a graduate from Dayspring Bible College and a graduate of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and has served in a number of churches and now joins us by phone. So, Daniel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, explain why this is so important. You also at the ERLIC, or the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, address a lot of controversial issues, and I have interviewed both of the heads of ERLIC, and I recognize that just by speaking those issues, you're immediately into a controversial area. So I think that's at least one of the reasons why you felt it was important for us to make sure that we are at least going to avoid what you call provocation. Isn't that at least part of the reason why you wrote this?
Yes, it is. I think there's a couple of reasons I wrote it. Number one, we're in a very uncivil time. I don't think I don't think we're in the most uncivil time that's ever been. If you study history, and if you're a believer in the Christian gospel, you know that ever since the Garden of Eden, humans have been finding new ways to savage each other verbally, rhetorically, and even to commit violence against each other. But I do think in this age, with the availability of communication platforms, that everybody has a voice and everybody can so easily express their opinion. I think there's just a fresh opportunity to be uncivil, and there's new and heightened levels of incivility. So that's one reason I thought it was important to address this. But the second reason, I think, is that when I read Scripture, particularly 1 Peter 3:15, for example, where Peter says that we should have an answer for every man for the hope that is within us. So we should be making apologetic answers. We should be answering the questions of the culture. We should be refuting untruths. But Peter also says to do that with gentleness and kindness. And so I think sometimes Christians get that first part where we have to have an answer, we have to speak truth, but we forget that second part. And Peter assumes that courage and civility go together. I think we often think that in order to be courageous, you can't be civil. In order to be civil, you can't be courageous. We think the loudest person in the room is the most brave. And the truth is, at times, Jesus was most courageous when he was silent. And so I think there's a lot for us Christians to learn.
I think so. And like you said, the social platforms, something we talk about on our Millennial Roundtable on Wednesdays, is certainly an issue because it makes it even easier. And that brings me to one of your points. Remember that even your ideological foes are humans. Now, again, as Christians, we would accept the fact that even if I may disagree with that individual, that person I disagree with is created in God's image. But sometimes even the social media make it possible for us to forget there's another human being on the other side. But even if we're face to face, we need to also recognize and remind ourselves that what we are dealing with is not an enemy, maybe even a potential friend or a potential ally. And that's really important in terms of our attitude, isn't it?
Yes, and I think the temptation is, on social media is to dehumanize your ideological foe because, you're not literally face-to-face with them. It's much easier to have what I call keyboard courage to say things or to type things or to tweet things that you wouldn't say in front of someone's face. You wouldn't say in person. And so I think even as we're having discussions online, even as we're making arguments, we need to picture in our minds the person with whom we're disagreeing as a full person, created in the image of God with dignity and respect. It says in the book of James that we're to respect all men. Peter says this as well, because they're made in the image of God. And so we should not let our digital age rob us of our humanity. And I think there's also a temptation not only to consider that other person less than human, but even ourselves, there's a temptation to sort of play act on a stage in a sense where we're projecting a kind of image of ourselves online that isn't really true.
Yes. Another one you talk about is give others the benefit of the doubt. And I love the question, if would I want people to wait to confirm the details before believing the worst about me? Sometimes you hear an initial story, I'll see a throwaway comment, I'll see a Twitter post, or even a news story, and I sometimes am tempted to jump at it, but I guess since I'm old enough and have been down the road enough, I say, okay, I need to hear a little bit more. If I get 2 or 3 people confirm the same thing, then I'm going to believe it. But I'm not going to jump at that first notice or that offhanded comment because, after all, I would want people to check some facts out, too, before they believe the worst about me.
That's exactly right. I think, there's not exactly a benefit of the doubt movement online. In fact,
no.
It's kind of discouraged. But I think as Christians, we should be slow to anger, slow to react, slow to tweet, I would say. Maybe let a story breathe a little bit, wait for some corroborating evidence, and then even ask ourselves, am I even the best person to react on this? Just because there's a story out there, just because something happened, do I have to comment on it right now online? And if the shoe was on the other foot, if this was me, how would I want to be treated? Because here's the truth. One day you may be joining the mob and piling on somebody and feeling good about yourself. The next day you may be the object of the mob's action. And so I really worry about a kind of mob mentality online that really seeks to sort of scapegoat people and sort of, as David Brooks calls it, the Coliseum culture, where we just love to sit around and see someone mercilessly beat up rhetorically.
Yes. Well, again, some of that maybe comes from, I've oftentimes said that I wouldn't like me very much either if all I knew about me is what I'd read in some of these Twitter posts or Facebook posts or even news magazine articles or newspapers, because it's just amazing how it gets twisted so quickly. So that's important. And just before we take a break, let's talk about another one. Understand that you don't have to comment on every news story. I love that because, like you said, let's let some of the stories breathe. Let's see if we got all the facts. Scriptures talk about the fact that you might listen to one individual and that seems right to you until you talk to the other individual and you get the rest of the story.
That's exactly right. Sometimes we need to hold our digital tongues. It's okay to sit out a few controversies. I always get a kick out of it when I see someone tweeting and saying, why is everybody being silent, or why is so-and-so being silent?
Yes,
and I want to say,
yes.
And I want to say, maybe they're not being silent. Maybe they're talking to their friends about it, but maybe they're not commenting on this medium at the time that you think they should. Just because someone wants you to be as mad on the internet as they are doesn't mean you have to give in to that peer pressure. There's no rule that says you have to be as outraged on the internet as they are.
Yes. Well, I'm taking a break, and we'll come back. We'll get into a couple more issues, but I remember an individual telling me recently that he was traveling. I think he was overseas at the time, and when he finally landed and finally got on his page, he had all these people saying, "Why didn't you say something about this?" And it's like, really? I mean, I wasn't even in the news cycle, and this demand that is coming down is certainly unhealthy. We're going to come back and talk about this idea of confirmation bias. That is certainly an important part of this, and a few other issues that we will cover. And it's all part of this article on civility and incivility. We'll continue our conversation with Daniel Darling right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1998, Pastor Richard Barr started a halfway house ministry in his hometown of Sinton, Texas. The idea was to offer housing, biblical instruction, and counseling to probationers and parolees as they prepared to transition back into civil society. For Pastor Barr, an ex-con himself, this was more than a ministry. It was personal. Barr ran the in-home ministry to ex-cons from his own home, located just a few feet from his church in Sinton, Texas. Things were going smoothly until about a year later when the city passed an ordinance preventing halfway houses within 1,000 feet of any church, school, park, or residential area. The city of Sinton at the time was less than 2.2 miles square, consisting of less than 6,000 residents. There was no place else for Barr to run his ministry in town. The city fathers had literally run him out of town with this ordinance, a fact they were later to admit was intentional. First Liberty Institute represented Pastor Barr and his ministry. We argued that the city violated the Texas Religious Freedom Restoration Act by substantially burdening his free exercise of religion without a compelling justification. The Texas Supreme Court agreed and invalidated the ordinance as to our client. Barr's case is yet another example of how a state's RFRA protects a small ministry seeking to do good to his community from the overbearing hand of government. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Daniel Darling with us for a few more minutes. And by the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Vice President for Communications for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. I might also mention some of his books, Teen People of the Bible, Crash Course, the original Jesus, one that certainly has struck a chord with a number of individuals because we sometimes want to mold Jesus in our image instead of allowing him to mold us in his image, The Dignity Revolution, and some others. others that we can certainly talk about. Talking about civility and incivility. And again, if you have some comments, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, you can also follow us on Facebook Live. It's a number of ways in which we make this available, not only through our various feeds, but there as well. If you want to leave a comment, we'll try to pick up that a little bit later. What about this issue of confirmation bias? You talk about that as well, and that seems to be something that we're dealing with, where we're more almost in our silos. We're almost more not even interacting with people that we would disagree with. And anytime we see something that kind of confirms our bias, we immediately run with it. What kind of descriptions and warnings could you give us about that?
Well, as Christians, we should care about the truth, and not just about the truth of who God is, but the truth about our world. And we live in an era where the news is really diffuse and deregulated, and in many ways that's good because we don't have to trust, like in the old days, the 3 news sources, which may or may not have been biased. Well, we can get, news from a variety of sources. But one of the bad things about that is now we can choose. We not only don't have the same opinions as our neighbors, but we also aren't dealing with the same set of facts, it seems like. And so it's very tempting to just find news that confirms what we already believe. And so I think when we read the news and we think about what's going on in the culture, we need to be very careful that we get news from a variety of different sources, and that we don't just believe a news story about someone with whom we disagree because it confirms what we already know about them, right? So if you're a progressive and you hear or read a bad story about a conservative institution or a conservative leader, it may very well be true, and there may very well be reason for outrage, but make sure the story is actually true before we just run with it. And the same thing if you're a conservative. If you're Christian and you come across a story that sounds so good about someone with whom you disagree, we need to check the sources. We need to make sure it's actually true. And I think we should refuse to automatically believe every bad news story about people we don't like. And we should refuse to automatically believe or to accept every good news story about people we do like, right? So everybody on our side is always virtuous and faithful, and everyone on the other side is a bunch of monsters. I think we just have to be wise about that.
Yeah, and it's hard to avoid that, because I do have to be honest that I see especially some of the enemies of the gospel and some of the people that are very critical of Christianity do that so quickly. They even make fun of things that are upright and righteous and holy and certainly should be lauded. So it's easy to fall into that trap, but it's one that we should avoid. And you sort of alluded to another point here. Listen to and learn from those who don't agree with you. It's possible to really be in not only a partisan echo chamber, but even sort of a Christian culture, subculture echo chamber. And I think it is helpful. I would say this more for mature Christians to read widely and to exercise discernment, but at the same time, don't just assume that the only things that I need to read are the things written by people that agree with me 100%, both in politics and theology.
Yeah, and I say this also emphasizing that there are certain core Christian convictions about which we will not budge. There are core aspects of theology and orthodoxy about which we should not move. But there's a lot of things that we talk about on social media or talk about in conversations that are a little bit more nuanced, that are a little bit more gray. And it's amazing sometimes how rigid and fixed we can be and certain in our opinions on matters of prudence and are not willing to listen to other people who might have a different perspective. They may not change our mind about it, but it may give us a more well-rounded perspective of the issue. We may actually learn something. We should interact with the best arguments from the other side, not choose the sort of weakest arguments so that we can just sort of beat up a straw man, but we should listen and learn from those people who don't necessarily come at things the way we do. Not only will we learn something, but I think it will give us insight into how to make better arguments.
And I might just mention that if people would like to get some more information about some of the things we're talking about today, we first of all have a link to your website, which is danieldarling.com. And then I'd also mention ERLIC, which again stands for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.com, as another resource, because these are places where you can find some information, some perspective. We even in the first hour today spent a little bit of time talking about family separation. You've got some material there. And if I can, let me promote your book, The Original Jesus, Trading the Myths We Create for the Savior Who Is. I know it's been out for a while, but it's a resource that I think would be very helpful, because we're finding more and more that we as Christians are supposed to recognize that we are to be in the image of Christ, or He's the potter, we're the clay. Somehow we turn that around, as I've seen you say in one of your videos, where we want to turn Him into the clay. And I've noticed this even outside of the Christian community. Everybody wants Jesus on their team. You see these bumper stickers that say, would Jesus drive an SUV? Who would care? What did Jesus say about homosexuality? I mean, and what we are seeing today is everybody, both inside the church and even outside the church, really trying to put Jesus in their own image. And I think your book's a great antidote to that.
Well, thank you for that. And I do think it is a problem. I wrote the book because I kept hearing people say, well, the Jesus I know would not do this.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, there's only one Jesus. There's the Jesus who is, and we can form our views to Him. But we kind of want to mold Jesus around our views. Jesus, believe it or not, in the 21st century is still very popular. The Jesus that we can kind of sprinkle on top of all of our hopes and dreams and our opinions. But the Christ of Scripture really challenges us and makes us uncomfortable and disrupts our ideas. And so in the book, I kind of go through some false ideas of Jesus and try to point us back to the true Christ.
Well, again, I just think it's a great resource, and I wanted people to be aware of that. And, of course, we've talked about that with you in the past, back in, I guess it was 2015. I looked it up. I said, is it actually been that long ago? But nevertheless, just another book I would recommend to individuals. And I'd also recommend this article that we actually have posted today, and it is entitled, Worried About Incivility? Start With Yourself. Daniel Darling is the author. It was in National Review, and I'm sure it's in other venues as well. So, Daniel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be on, and I'm grateful for your work in ministry.
Well, we're going to have to do it again, and I think we will. So, again, if you would like to know a little bit more about some of those issues, we've made it available for you here at Point of View. Again, as you go there, you can find out some information first about Jonathan Petersen. He was with us in that first half hour talking about the case for biblical self-defense. It's a booklet, and we've got a link there that might help you. Of course, you can go and use the email address that we mentioned. Then Daniel Darling's book, of course, is available through his website, which we have on the website, our Point of View website. We also have the article there as well, and I will probably, before we're done today, get back to this issue of family separation. That's the first article we've posted. But when we come back, what I want to do in the next hour is spend a little bit of time talking about another one of these cases, similar to ones that we've dealt with in terms of Kelly Shackelford. This one comes from our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom, the Ragamuffins Coffee House. Just wanted to have a worship time. Oh, no, can't do that, at least in the state of Maryland. So we'll talk about that case right after this.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151. and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to talk about religious liberty here for just a little bit, and it relates to another one of those kind of head-scratching cases. You know as well as I, if you've listened to this program any length of time, we have somebody from, say, Alliance Defending Freedom, whether it's Alan Sears or now Michael Ferris, or when we have Kelly Shackelford with First Liberty in studio with us on Fridays. They'll tell us a story, and we'll go, that just can't be true. You really got to be making this up. And just one of those ones where you just say, is it really possible that people in government are so anti-church and anti-ministry as to prohibit those who are really doing a very good work? And one example of this comes out of the state of Maryland in the suburb of Laurel between Baltimore and D.C., and that is the Ragamuffins Coffee House. Now, Ragamuffins is really based on the Ragamuffin Gospel of Brennan Manning, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But this is done by the Redemption Community Church and put together this nonprofit coffee shop, which really was trying to reach out and minister to the community. And almost immediately, there were all sorts of pieces of evidence to suggest that the city wanted to zone them out and drive them out. And it's so obviously aimed at them that finally our friends at ADF felt that they had to file suit and have done so. So we wanted to give you some more perspective on that. So the legal counsel involved with that is Christiana Holcomb. She is legal counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom and is a key member of the Center for Christian Ministries. Has worked in the area of protecting freedom of churches and others and been involved in a number of cases, has her law degree from Oak Brook College of Law and Government Policy, and is an individual that is really kind of front and center on this case. So, Christiana, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let's, if we can, have you maybe tell some of the story. I tried to explain that this is located in kind of a poor neighborhood in Maryland, and yet I have posted an article here that's really kind of a compiling of various articles from FaithWire and Christian Post and even Ragamuffins website and some of the others, so people can read the whole story. But it seems like almost from the beginning, those people in the city wanted to do what they could to prevent this coffee house and this church from having a dynamic and effective ministry in that community. But tell us more.
Well, you're exactly right, and it certainly appears that way. The Redemption Community Church is a small congregation really with a heart to minister to the poor and the underprivileged in its community. And so it decided that the Lord was leading it to locate in the downtown Laurel, Maryland area so that it could better serve those to whom it felt called to minister. It found its idea for ministry was, as you mentioned earlier, was to have a house of worship with a ministry of a coffee shop. It felt like this would be a great way to create a warm and welcoming environment so that those who might not feel comfortable walking through church doors would be able to encounter the gospel in a very warm, welcoming, and a non-confrontational environment. So they set out, looked for property, but just 3 days after walking through this property with city officials, the city of Laurel started to change its zoning code. First, it changed it to ban nonprofit organizations, and then secondly, it changed the law to stop houses of worship from locating in the downtown area without first seeking special permission from the city. And unfortunately, that just violates clear federal law. Federal law and the First Amendment do not allow city officials or city governments to treat religious organizations less favorably than secular assemblies. And unfortunately, that's what happened in this case.
Well, and yesterday we actually had someone on here that I've used as cases from many, many decades ago, interestingly enough, in which at that time when they were doing a Christian school, they were going to have to get a special use permit every year to keep the school open. And that was one of the first times I said, I think this is going to be the big conflict in the future on religious liberty. It won't be the big cases, although, of course, we just had one of those ADF cases resolved in the Supreme Court on Masterpiece Cake Shop. But most of those have to do with, as many people have pointed out, this expensive, time-consuming, and most importantly, uncertain process of getting a special use permit, and it's just a way to drive these kinds of businesses, schools, and other activities just out of their community, isn't it?
You're exactly right. No city should use its zoning ordinances for religious discrimination. But unfortunately, that has been an ongoing problem, not only in Laurel, Maryland, but frankly across the country as well. And for that very reason, Congress passed a specific federal law designed to address this question. So that's the reason why Alliance Defending Freedom brought this lawsuit. We think it's important to hold city officials accountable and ensure that they treat people from all walks of life equally and fairly.
Well, again, you're bringing the suit and the district court for the District of Maryland. We're also familiar with every time we seemingly turn around, if we don't get a strange ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court out in California, we get a strange ruling from the Fourth Circuit Court, which is where this would be as well. So what are the prospects here? Because like you said, we have federal law and I think pretty clear guidelines. This should be a simple decision, but what do you think might actually take place?
It should be a very simple decision, as you're exactly right. And we're very optimistic that the church will ultimately prevail in this case. Look, on the face of the law itself, there are 13 different secular organizations that can locate in downtown Laurel, Maryland as of right. But it's only houses of worship, churches, that the city of Laurel has decided must be treated less favorably and undergo a very burdensome and expensive special exception process. And that's just a clear, blatant violation of federal law. And we're optimistic that the federal court in this case and even the Fourth Circuit will agree with that.
Well, again, we've posted an article there about this particular case, and we also, of course, have a link to our good friends at ADF. And just before we go, of course, I mentioned the one from Masterpiece Cake, which was a 7-2 decision. As I understand, I think we're still waiting for the case out of California dealing with the Pregnancy Resource Center, aren't we?
That's exactly right. So keep your eyes peeled for Thursday morning. That's the next date that the U.S. Supreme Court could issue decisions, and we're hopeful that NIFLA will be among them.
Yes, well, we thought it was going to be last Friday. I think it might be this Thursday, but we'll see. And again, just amazing. ADF had two very important cases before the Supreme Court, and the first one was a victory. We'll see how the next one goes. And Christiana, always great to talk with anyone at ADF, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will come back to this again and update you on this issue of the Christian Coffee House. Again, we have a link to Alliance Defending Freedom. It's adflegal.org. You don't have to remember that because, of course, we have that link there. And, of course, we have the ruling that was favorably towards Jack Phillips in terms of the Masterpiece Cake case. Of course, they also are representing Baronelle Stutzman. She is the florist in Washington. And, of course, the Pregnancy Center case that we just mentioned a minute ago. We come back, though. What about separating the kids at the border? How do we think about these issues? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Major depression has surged in the United States among young Americans. That is according to a report based on medical and survey information conducted by Blue Cross Blue Shield. The survey looked at 41 million people covered under the insurance plan. Why the dramatic increase? Perhaps further study will give more definitive answers, but the report has some educated guesses. The researchers suspect that online activities such as social media and video games may be part of the problem. Add to this the social isolation that comes from spending too much time in front of a screen, and you have some possible reasons for increased depression among the young. The actual numbers are alarming. Diagnoses of major depression increased by a third between 2013 and 2016. That breaks down to 63% increase for adolescents and a 47% increase among millennials. Dr. Karen Horowitz is a psychiatrist in Rhode Island who is quoted in the study. She says, "It is possible increased rates of depression in adolescents are related to a combination of increased electronics use and sleep disruptions in already vulnerable individuals. Increased use of electronics, video games more commonly in boys, and social texting and media more commonly in girls, can lead to increased conflict both within the home and with peers." We do know that some people are born with genetic traits that make them more vulnerable to depression in response to trauma and other negative situations. We do have to wonder how increased online activities affect those people in particular. I think we now have in this new report another warning of the potential dangers of allowing young people to spend too much time in front of a screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, let's talk about what is happening at our border, the detention of children, the separation of children from their families, and a number of issues. First of all, let me just mention that the first article we've posted here is by David French. He's been on the program with us, and it's amazing how many times when I look for good articles, I end up coming back to David French, and I think part of it is because he is a very good writer. Number two, he's a Christian. Number three, he's got a legal background, and he's very fair. And he starts his piece by really helping us kind of summarize, how did we get here? I mean, I think a lot of us are looking around going, how did we get to the point where we have children being separated from their parents and people behind what look like cages, and how did all this happen? And he does a really good job in his opening paragraph to kind of summarize what the other day when I was trying to do this, and it took me about 15 minutes. So I got to love it because he says, first of all, one presidential administration enters into a consent decree that creates a nationwide policy for detention, release, and treatment of minors in the custody of federal immigration authorities and makes it binding on future administrations. Okay, let me kind of exegete this as we go through this. That consent decree is known as the Flores Settlement Agreement, and it was one that was accepted by this administration we're talking about is Bill Clinton in 1997. So first step is this consent decree that comes out, which is later modified by the Ninth Circuit Court in California. So that's the first thing. So first paragraph, one presidential administration enters into a consent decree, and it also has an HTML link. So if you'd like to actually read it, it will link you to that. You can read it if you'd like. I would imagine maybe only a few interested lawyers might want to read it, but it's there. Then his second sentence Another administration, this would be the Obama administration, unilaterally implements a catch-and-release policy for illegal immigrants that works to incentivize additional illegal immigration, including illegal immigration by families with kids. Now, the point he's making is that under the Obama administration, they simply said, okay, if you come to the border and you are here illegally, or if you come to the border and you're actually asking for asylum, we will give you a court date. We'll release you into the general population, and we expect you to come back for that court date, that hearing, I should say. And they don't come back. It's catch and release. And as I've jokingly said before, as a person that likes to fly fish every once in a while, catch and release is fine for trout. It's not so good for immigration policy, and that's exactly what's been taking place. So then, he says in the third paragraph, the next administration, that would be the Trump administration, reverses course, adopting a so-called zero-tolerance policy that effectively combines with the consent decree to create a new punishment for misdemeanor offenses of illegal entry, and that is family separation, including the separation of very young children from their parents. And as he goes on, he talks about this chain of events that happens between a consent decree, which was a new law without a statute, then various regulatory rulemaking and all the rest, and none of it passed by Congress. And I love what he says, the founders shudder. And that's really what is the case. It's time for Congress to actually deal with this. And in just a few minutes, I will get into what I think is at least a reasonable solution that has been proposed by Senator Ted Cruz. And I'll also, in order to be fair, we'll also talk about a solution that has been proposed by Senator Dianne Feinstein. But I think it's important for us as Christians for just a minute to recognize when we come to these issues, we really need to have both our biblical convictions and our biblical compassion. Our biblical convictions, what are those? Well, in Romans 13, 1-7, we are to obey those in authority. Government was ordained by God, and government is given the use of authority to do so. Now, I recognize that our Attorney General the other day, when he quoted Romans 13, he was made fun of, pilloried, criticized for that. But I think as Christians, we have to recognize that we recognize the importance of government maintaining borders. You have in Deuteronomy 32 the idea of fixing the borders of people. You have in Proverbs 22 that we shouldn't move the ancient landmarks. There's a lot of verses that talk about the importance of having borders. And even if you don't accept our biblical point of view, I recognize some of you listening say, well, I don't accept your biblical views. Okay. You still have to say a country that does not actually enforce its borders is not a country. It's just a place. I mean, somewhere along the line, you have to come to an understanding that a border is important, and the regulation of those borders and the allowing in or keeping out of certain individuals is really key. And if you don't think that's important, just look at Europe right now. There was a study that just came out. I'm going to do a commentary on it, where over 1,000 individuals have either been assaulted or killed in Europe due to individuals that were brought into Europe or allowed to come into Europe. Some of those, of course, were terrorist actions. Others were just individuals that either raped, assaulted, burglarized, whatever. I mean, the numbers are pretty striking of what happens when you don't maintain your borders, and we have seen this in other countries. We certainly even can see what happens here. So on the one hand, we certainly recognize that we should have our biblical convictions about the rule of law. On the other hand, we should also have our biblical compassion about the fact that Scripture also, in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament, actually challenges us to treat the alien, the sojourner, with compassion. We see this, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 34, various passages there. We see that even in the book of Exodus, right next to the Ten Commandments, we see that you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him. And even in the New Testament, in Hebrews 13, do not neglect to show hospitality to the stranger. So there are just a lot of verses that you could use in terms of having biblical compassion as well. Well, before I get to the Ted Cruz bill, let me try to respond to a couple of the false claims being made out there and sort those through. And these appeared in the Daily Signal. Fred Lucas has actually called it fact-checking 4 claims about detaining children at the border. Question number 1, is this problem that we're dealing with right now a problem because of the Democrats or because of Donald Trump? Donald Trump asserted, quote, the Democrats forced that law upon our nation. And, of course, you have to recognize that some have said, well, it was the change in the Trump administration's policies that created that. Again, I sort of walked you through it, but let me walk you through it one more time. In 1997, the Clinton administration entered into what was called the Flores Settlement Agreement, which ended a class action lawsuit brought in the 1980s. And the settlement basically said that unaccompanied minors could be released from custody to their parents, relatives, or other caretakers after no more than 20 days. And so you have to, first of all, remember the 20-day figure, because sometimes when you're dealing with issues where there is an immigrant asking for asylum, it takes more than 20 days. So you have a difficulty there. Then you fast forward to 2008. At this point, George W. Bush is still the president, but it is pretty much a democratically controlled Congress that passed a piece of legislation known as the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. And that said that unaccompanied minors entering the United States must be transferred to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement rather than the Department of Homeland Security. And of course, that's what's taking place there as well. And at the same time, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals expanded the Flores settlement to include children brought to the country illegally by their parents. So now you have a situation in which they actually almost are set up for the possibility of separating children from their parents. But after the break, I want to talk about 3 other very important claims. One of this is this an unprecedented action by the Trump administration? Number 2, are these concentration camps? Because some people have used that phraseology. And number 3, do we have evidence, as it's been reported, at least in one case, of babies being taken from nursing mothers? So these are all part of 4 claims that were fact-checked by our friends at Daily Signal. Then we'll get into what Senator Ted Cruz has proposed, and contrast that with what Senator Dianne Feinstein has proposed, and we'll get into that as well. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. But I'm trying to give you some of the facts which seem to be obliterated because all we're seeing are images of children in difficult situations, admittedly, and individuals using this for their political advantage. But how do we think through this issue? What are the issues? Why is this happening? And most importantly, are there reasonable solutions to that? And I think there are. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Nancy was uncomfortable, to say the least. As an introvert, she didn't like controversy. But when she learned that parents were prohibited from seeing the contents of a major standardized test, she knew her responsibilities as a parent needed to outweigh her discomfort. Her daughter turned out to be the only student in her district to opt out of the test, and one of just a handful in the entire state of Texas. But she stood her ground, and the next year, Point of View helped her unite with other parents to make a difference for their children. The world loves to force us into its mold and to mock believers when we resist. Your gift to Point of View is an investment in courage and changed lives. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. Be part of amazing transformations. It all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking in to pointofview.net. One day, you were going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to those calls in just a minute, but I did want to at least finish my points that, again, are some fact-checking, and one of those is this an unprecedented action by the Trump administration? Well, it depends on how you define unprecedented. The idea of zero tolerance really refers back to the way we used to deal with that. But after a while in which the Obama administration said, well, we'll just ask people to come back to a hearing and give them a particular date for their hearing, they don't really show up. And so that is why on May 7th in Scottsdale, Arizona, Attorney General Jeff Sessions directed federal prosecutors to prosecute all adults who illegally enter the country, including those accompanied by their children, under the provision that is actually in the law. Now, you can say that you only have a couple of options, really one of two. Either you release every family that crosses the border and claims asylum, knowing that most of them will never show up for their immigration court hearing, or you can release the child as required by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals interpretation of the Flores Agreement, and then hold the parents while awaiting trial. There is kind of a third option, which I'll get to in just a minute, and that's what Ted Cruz is proposing, so I'll get to that in just a minute. But let me take the second point, and that is, are these concentration camps? You know, there's been a lot of hyperbole lately, and you've had the former CIA director Michael Hayden and others, and of course, this suggests that this is Nazi concentration camps. Of course, you've heard everything from two former first ladies to a variety of, and to including the first current first lady, all criticizing that. But again, it's important when you see these images to recognize that in the last fiscal year, about 90% of the apprehended children were released to a sponsor who was either a parent or a close relative. So what you're seeing are those that either are in process or have not been claimed. But again, that doesn't change anything. I mean, the wire fences and all that, I mean, it's bad optics, but it's bad reality as well. But the last point I thought I'd take real quickly, and that is, there were reports that said that an illegal immigrant from Honduras claimed that her nursing daughter was pulled away from her before she was handcuffed. And first of all, there's no way to check the validity of that claim other than, again, the Department of Homeland Security, a senior official said, we do not separate breastfeeding children from their parents. That does not exist. That is not our policy. It is not something DHS does. We believe that that is false. So, again, those are some of those claims, and I just think whenever you hear those claims, sometimes you need to be a little bit careful about what you believe or don't believe. Okay, are there solutions to this? Yes. How the Senate votes on these, and then, of course, the House votes on these, will tell you real quickly whether or not we have individuals in the Congress that really want to solve this problem or whether they want to use it as a political weapon because it is, after all, an election year. But first of all, the bill being proposed by Senator Ted Cruz, it's emergency legislation, would actually double the number of immigration judges to 750. That's key because one of the problems is that sometimes these particular cases take longer than that mandated 20 days that we just talked about in terms of the Flores Agreement. So that's the first point. And in most cases, this bill would actually require that illegal immigrant families be kept together unless they're, and here's the catch, aggravated criminal conduct, or there's a threat to the harm of the child. The legislation would also authorize new temporary shelters for immigrant families and provide for expedited resolution of asylum claims within 14 days. Because, again, that 20-day limit. Of course, we could change the Flores Agreement, but you're going to have to deal with that in the courts, and some of that is tied up to the 1997 agreement that came with the Clinton administration, and then the more recent one in about 2008 with the Ninth Circuit Court. So that's the bill by Ted Cruz. The bill being proposed by Senator Dianne Feinstein, where the Senate Democrats said they have announced their support, is one called the Keep Families Together Act. It is different in that it has a much higher standard for separating kids at the border. It would generally only allow the practice of separating the children if there is evidence of parents abusing the child or the child being trafficked. And under the Democrats' bill, separation will only happen after consultation with a child welfare expert. Recognize that some of these individuals being separated are actually the traffickers themselves. They claim to be the parent, but there is evidence that they are not. And so that's another issue to put in this conversation. But let's open up the phones and give some of you a chance to join the conversation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to the state of Georgia first. And Rose, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Good afternoon. I wanted to say that I'm a first-time caller, and that as adults, we are responsible to protect and to care for the least among us. And my idea of the least among us would be the unborn child, seniors, and minor children. And I think that it is important that we should protect our borders. I'm reminded when I look at the Bible that Jesus himself was an illegal. And so people fleeing from one part of the world to the other is not new. Matthew 18, verse 6, and Luke 17, verse 2 reminds us that as adults, it is our responsibility to take care of the least among us. And if we don't, then it will be better if a stone was put around our neck and we were thrown into the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. And so I think that as Christians, we do need to make prudent decisions in terms of how we go about resolving this issue. It's significant. I think I spent the last couple of nights unable to sleep because it's just been so horrifying thinking and seeing children in cages. And as evangelicals, we need to be talking to our Congress people, our senators, whomever it is that we need to talk to, the White House, so that this stops, and it stops now.
And again, would you support some of the legislation we've talked about? We've talked about Senator Ted Cruz and also, of course, one by Senator Dianne Feinstein. Would you think that is a way to solve some of these problems?
I think that partially it's probably a way to solve the problem, but I think that there should be a zero tolerance on removing minor children, particularly babies, from their parents. I think I'm somewhat comfortable hearing you say that we're not sure that a breastfed baby was removed from its parents, but if that happens, I mean, the types of picture that leads to the mind, the hurt and the pain that all mothers feel just hearing that is unreasonable.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your phone call. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a couple more calls in just a minute, but let's talk about, again, some of the basics for this emergency legislation, because a lot of you are saying, okay, what are we supposed to do? Ted Cruz's points are these, and this comes from another piece that just came out here. First of all, it would double the number of federal immigration judges from roughly about 375 to 750. And that is part of the problem. We aren't processing these cases fast enough. And, of course, I might just mention that this is quickly overwhelming the situation. We have, in round numbers, about, what is it there? I was looking at this the other day, 200 children just in one of the facilities in McAllen, Texas alone. So this has gotten to be very significant. It's almost like an invasion. So that's the first issue, to process these fast enough. Number two, his bill would authorize new temporary shelters with accommodations to keep families together, which I think will allow it still to be under the regulations and the consent agreement that was agreed to. Number three, that it would mandate that illegal immigrant families must be kept together absent aggravated criminal conduct or a threat of harm to the children. And then finally, it would provide for expedited processing and review of asylum cases so that within 14 days, those who meet the legal standards will be granted asylum, and those who do not will be immediately returned to their home countries. So that's the situation we find ourselves in right now at the border. And I'm hoping that going into the detail that I did doesn't bore you, but helps you understand how did we get to this situation, and more importantly, how do we get ourselves out of it. So I'm going to take a break, and I can see a whole bank of phone calls. I will do my best when we come back to give as many of you a chance to express your opinion. So give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after we return.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1998, Pastor Richard Barr started a halfway house ministry in his hometown of Sinton, Texas. The idea was to offer housing, biblical instruction, and counseling to probationers and parolees as they prepared to transition back into civil society. For Pastor Barr, an ex-con himself, this was more than a ministry. It was personal. Barr ran the in-home ministry to ex-cons from his own home, located just a few feet from his church in Sinton, Texas. Things were going smoothly until about a year later when the city passed an ordinance preventing halfway houses within 1,000 feet of any church, school, park, or residential area. The city of Sinton at the time was less than 2.2 miles square, consisting of less than 6,000 residents. There was no place else for Barr to run his ministry in town. The city fathers had literally run him out of town with this ordinance, a fact they were later to admit was intentional. First Liberty Institute represented Pastor Barr and his ministry. We argued that the city violated the Texas Religious Freedom Restoration Act by substantially burdening his free exercise of religion without a compelling justification. The Texas Supreme Court agreed and invalidated the ordinance as to our client. Barr's case is yet another example of how a state's RFRA protects a small ministry seeking to do good to his community from the overbearing hand of a government. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention again the first article we've posted here by David French. Now is the time Congress should end family separation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Delaney in Illinois, what's your point of view?
Hi, I'm calling in because I think separating children from their parents could have lasting effects on their basically ability to socialize, first of all, and be a normal citizen within America. I think that you need your parents there to teach you right and wrong, to give you a moral code. So if we're worried about the crime rate right now with immigrants, we kind of have to think about the future. You know, we got to think about, okay, maybe like 10, 20 years down the line, these people were ripped away from their parents. So the odds of them, you know, getting into criminal activity, like, you know, it's pretty high.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I think there's even a technical word for it, miasma. And so, again, we should do what we can to keep families intact, and that's what you are seeing right now in some of the legislation. Try to at least explain how we got to this situation, but nevertheless, it is something that I hope Congress will act on very quickly. Let me take a few more calls real quickly. We'll go to South Carolina, WLPG. And Brian, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Kirby, thank you for taking my call. Let me speak. I want to make the difference between the sojourner spoken of in the book of Exodus and 22nd chapter of Ezekiel, and we are told to not mistreat nor oppress the sojourner or the stranger, but the stranger or the sojourner of whom they spoke was an accepted person come into the land for working or for taking the crops, whatever they would be doing, but they were
Kind of
invited
like a guest worker visa, if you will, but it wasn't necessarily that formalized. Very well said. Yes, go ahead.
They were invited guests, but they were never referred to as an invader was never referred to as a sojourner or a stranger. They were merely enemies who were invading the land, who were uninvited guests who had come in and were invading. That is a very different term from what the Bleeding Heart, who spoke a few minutes ago, was describing. An illegal alien is an invader, and as such, when they have no documentation, they come into a center of which we speak, they have no expectation of any kind of treatment except to be removed from the country.
Well, again, some of them may actually apply for asylum, so we do provide that context. But again, that's part of it. Is it's a little bit of a gameplay. I'm asking for asylum, so that just begins the whole process of having to go before a federal immigration judge. That's why Ted Cruz said, okay, if that's what's going to happen, then we need to increase the number of judges to 750, virtually almost double that, in order to do what we can to address this problem. So I appreciate that clarification. It's a good one. Let's go back. We'll stay in South Carolina for another minute. We'll go to Lorraine. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I love your show. I listened to all of this, and I just want to remind, like America, that there's 750,000 children in foster care. And every day, those American children get ripped out of their houses, and they're put with not even their relatives sometimes. And this never gets really heard about, and it's never blown up to these proportions. And I wish we forget about that. Our own children, every day they get pulled out of homes and they get put in, hopefully with very good foster parents, but people they don't know. And sometimes when they're with these foster parents, for whatever reason, even if they're happy and they're doing well, they can get pulled out of those homes and go into another foster home. So this happens on our own turf with our own American children. But you don't hear anything about it.
Well, again, let's be honest to recognize that some of the coverage, not all of it, so I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but some of this is an attempt to really kind of distract from a couple of things that we have been talking about, like the Inspector General's report from the Justice Department and what's happening in the economy and the issue of tariffs and all sorts of other issues. And of course, Stormy Daniels, and you go through the long, long list. So part of this is a distraction, but it also is something that draws the eyes and emotions of individuals. So that's why you've got so much coverage of it right now. But I do want to put some of it in context, especially if you dislike the Trump administration. You say, this is what was caused by the Trump administration. I can't believe they're doing this. And I was trying to help you understand that there were a series of decisions that took place before this that actually ended up where we are right now. And again, the question is, we've got a problem at the border. We've got a problem where we have hundreds of kids stuck in some of these facilities. We've got the separation of kids from their parents. What are some solutions? And, of course, Ted Cruz has a piece of legislation. Dianne Feinstein has a piece of legislation. And so let's see what we can do to turn some of this around and address the issue. But I appreciate you bringing that up because it's a reminder that we do separate kids from parents for lots of different reasons, including whether or not they are going to be charged with a crime. And in many cases, at least this is a misdemeanor. If they're there on more than one occasion, it even is sometimes seen as a felony. But let me take at least one more phone call here. I think Roy in North Carolina wants to address the issue of how we think about this biblically. So, Roy, you have the floor.
Yes, sir. How you doing this afternoon?
I'm good. What would you add to our conversation today?
Well, I wanted to add to it. This is all political. It's all political, as the caller prior to me had just mentioned. But also, I wanted to address. I think it was a young lady from Georgia when she quoted Matthew there. See, you have to, not saying that she's not knowledgeable, but interpretation before application. This is not applicable as far as to the church, but because it's established among you. And then prior to that, it's all about training up a child in the way it should go. But then who's doing the training? Is that person saved or not? Because they trained the wrong way. So all that is out the window. It's predominantly it's political. It is to take the eye off of what is all the good things that our president has been doing. We've never had a president elected in office that has done everything correct, but we've always had them there that we gave them a chance. And I think really with the other side there, you can call them Democrats or liberals or whatever you want to, they are not giving him a chance. I think they really fear that he's probably he is being successful, and he's probably going to go down in history to be the most successful president that we've had in office. And I think basically this is all a political stunt, because if this country don't have borders, then what you're saying is it's really not a country anymore.
That's
it's
right.
Just a big nation or a large city or something, and we forget that we have borders, which are nothing more than boundaries, because we established those in our house.
Sure. And again, I wish I had a little more time, but I'm coming to the end of the program here. And if you found yourself saying, I wanted to get through, but I didn't get through, well, there's always tomorrow, and we'll come back to some of the conversation as well. I hope, if nothing else, I tried to help you understand how we got to this point through a series of decisions, none of which were passed by Congress. You know what? As one of our callers pointed out, it's time to go to Congress and say, you need to fix this. And we have some pieces of legislation, so I want to see an up or down vote on it. And I want to see it now. I don't want it festering all through the election season. Well, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress. But thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just